COVID-19. No other event in recent memory had such a profound, disruptive, and transformative impact on businesses and on all of our lives as the global pandemic. However, because the pandemic affected all of us, the topic of COVID-19 is not always discussed very fact-based. It's discussed very emotionally, and sometimes we mix conspiracy theories, rumors in with the facts. So in this session, I would like to take a step back and take a very fact-based look at the pandemic from 4 angles. First, the humanitarian crisis. Second, the business and economic impact of the crisis. Third, we're going to look at the financial markets and the impact the crisis had on the financial markets so far. And last but not least, we are looking also at the social impact of the crisis. So let's dive right into it. First, I want to start with getting us all on the same page of what COVID-19 is. It is an infectious disease. It is caused by a SARS-CoV-2 virus, and it evolved in China in late 2019 and spread globally in early 2020. Now, the disease itself is mild in 80% of patients. It causes fever, cough, tiredness, loss of taste or smell. But the reason why it has become such a dramatic and traumatic event globally is because it has severe impact in 13% of cases and a critical impact in 6% of cases, with quite a high death toll as well. So if we look at the trajectory of how COVID-19 started to spread, we see here that it started to spread first of all in China in January and February 2020, but was very quickly brought under control by the authorities in China through very drastic lockdown measures. But by March 2020, the crisis started to spread into Europe and then later also into the US. And the number of cases started to go up in those geographies as well. The scary part really was how fast the virus spread. So it was highly infectious. And if we compare, and you see it here, the yellow line is SARS back in 2002, 2003. And the blue line is COVID-19. So you can see the difference of how fast this virus really spread compared to previous pandemics. The trajectory looks quite different depending on which region we are going to look at. So it started off obviously in China, but then took off in Europe and in the US. While in Europe during the summer of 2020, the numbers went down quite a bit and stayed down. It really took over in the US, in Asia, in Africa. And we see, depending on the region, different trajectories because of different measures that the governments took in those regions. What is noticeable here, and we will come back to this in a second, is the second wave hit really harder, and every wave that followed actually hit harder than the first couple of waves, indicating that the governments really struggled to bring the crisis under control. And while it started off mostly in Asia, it very quickly affected all countries. You see here in the early days in March, 2 countries highlighted here specifically, which is China and Italy, which was the starting point of the crisis in Europe. But then the corona hotspots shifted basically from the east to the west. So most of Asia got the crisis under control, and the hotspots shifted towards Europe and the US and also South America. In January 2022, we reached globally a new peak of cases. So on 13th of January, we had globally 2.8 million new cases and a 7-day average of also 2.8 million cases per day. The good news, however, is that the death rate has been coming down. So this latest wave of what we call the Omicron variant is much less severe. So as of 13 January, we saw on one day 7,191 deaths globally, with a 7-day average of 6,717. And this is significantly down from the previous year and from previous peaks that we had, for example, in December, January of 2020-21, and then again another peak around April, May 2021. If you look at Thailand, the most current wave is actually not as severe as the previous wave. So here in Thailand, we had our peak back in August 2021. But we see the numbers coming up after the new year. To as of 12th of January, it was 15,800 new cases. China used to be very long in the top countries with COVID infections. Now that has changed, and then most of the cases now are actually happening in the US, in India, and in Brazil. So these three countries are heading the list of new cases right now, especially with the Omicron variant. Now, we already mentioned variants, so just quickly recapping why this latest variant is called the Omicron variant. Variants are named after the Greek alphabet. So actually, in fact, there is an alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on variant. Some variants are more well known to the public because they seem to be the more dominant and more severe variants. So many people talked about the Delta variant that was prominently featured in the news, and now the Omicron variant again. Just to highlight that there are many more variants that may not have been discussed very much in public. Now, the latest statistics. So globally, in total, as of 15th of January, we had 324 million cases. Out of these 324, 265 million have recovered. So about 82% have been fully recovered. And we see a death rate of 1.7%, so 5.5 million deaths so far caused by the coronavirus. Now, what is important to note is that the mortality rate heavily depends on age group. At least that's what the statistics suggest. So you see here, the numbers vary across geographies. On the left side, the global statistics. On the right side is only the state of Ohio in the US. But the trend or the pattern is very similar. It seems to be more severe in the age group of 60 up, where we see like significantly higher death rates than in the lower age groups. Now, we might wonder, is this something unique? Is this something that the world has never seen before? And here, and I will link the video up on the screen. I want to point to a video that has been posted actually pretty much 1 year before the COVID-19 crisis started. You see it here on the 30th of November 2018, by the University of Cambridge, warning actually that something like the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919 might happen again. And when you watch the video, you will see that there's so many parallels, and it seems like we haven't really learned from history. It's really worth watching this video from the University of Cambridge. Again, keeping in mind that this has been posted 1 year before the COVID-19 crisis has started. I will put the link in above. Now, we had other pandemics. What is so special about this pandemic is that it spread very fast, that it reached such a large number of population, that it had such a high death rate. In terms of the fatality rate, 1.7% is actually not as high as other severe viruses that you see on this page. However, the other viruses didn't spread so fast and so rapidly as the COVID-19 virus. Closing with a remark on vaccinations. So far, globally, as of beginning of January 2022, 4.6 billion people globally, so 60% almost of the world population, have received at least one dose of vaccines. Fully vaccinated, which is like 2 vaccinations, are 50% of the world population, so 3.9 billion people. And a third vaccination, like a booster, has been received by 549 million people, which is 7% of the global population. So this might be one of the reasons also why the hospitalizations and the death rates have been coming down, because the vaccinations have actually taken off. Now, I know that the topic of vaccinations is widely discussed, especially in Western countries, but it appears, at least from the fact base, that there is some correlation. Either the virus has adjusted and has become less severe, or the vaccinations really have had an impact, a positive impact on the hospitalizations and the death rates. Probably also a combination of the two. But keeping in mind that I'm not a virologist, so this is just taking the data and drawing conclusions. So this was just a quick recap of the humanitarian crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis as a disease. Now I want to jump into business and economics and look at the impact that COVID-19 had on businesses and on the economies worldwide. First of all, the business impact that COVID-19 had is something that truly has been unseen before. We see here a picture of Suvarnabhumi Airport, for example, completely deserted. On the right side, a picture of restaurants that had to close, shopping malls had to close. Shopping malls that used to be bustling and busy places have been completely empty. The roads that had traffic jams in normal times were completely empty as people were staying at home. So the business impact is very, very severe, just looking at those pictures and those examples. Now, looking at the impact on the economy, McKinsey actually has in regular intervals interviewed senior leaders and managers of businesses and has asked them about their assessment of the crisis and what the trajectory is going to be along 2 dimensions. So one dimension is how good the policy response is from governments worldwide, so how well governments react and try to revive the economy and how effective that is. And on the y-axis here, what the public health response is, so how effective the vaccinations are, how quickly governments bring the spread of the virus under control. And based on those 2 dimensions, McKinsey has created 9 scenarios of what the trajectory of the economic impact of the crisis would look like, with A4 being the lightest impact scenario, so-called scenario A4, being the lightest impact with highly effective economic interventions and effective virus control, and B3 being the most pessimistic and the most heavily impacted scenario, where economic interventions are ineffective and also there's a failure of public health authorities to control the virus spread. Now, the latest survey results indicate that most business leaders believe in the middle scenario, which is A1, which basically said there is a moderate impact of the economic policies, and also we get the crisis under control, we get the spread of the virus under control to some extent, but it could be better. Now, what does this scenario mean? Basically, in scenario A1, we are talking about an impact on the economy of about minus 8% for 2020, which has already passed, and an economic recovery towards Q3 2022. So that would be the most likely scenario. And obviously, in the better scenarios, we would have a faster improvement and there's also worse cases. But the most likely, assessed by business leaders, is a full recovery to pre-crisis levels in Q3 2022. Yeah, and on different geographies that would have a different impact, of course, and it would also impact the return to pre-crisis levels at different times. So in the US, it would mean, for example, a return to pre-crisis levels in Q2 2023, the Eurozone slightly slower worldwide, as I mentioned, in Q3 2022, and China obviously would be ahead of time with the full recovery to pre-crisis levels. However, the uncertainty is high, and what we see here is how the responses have really evolved over time. It's a little bit hard to see, but you see this zigzag line across, and these are the different scenarios. So from A4 being the most optimistic to B3, the black one being the most pessimistic scenario. And you see that over time, business leaders in their response jump depending on how the crisis has evolved in the most recent times. And it seems that with the Omicron variant, actually the outlook is a little bit more pessimistic. So the pessimistic scenarios actually have grown in the response by the business leaders, while the very optimistic scenarios seem to be less likely, at least in the latest polls. Now, one important, interesting thing that McKinsey also found out is that the economic response actually seems to have relatively little impact on the actual recovery rate, meaning the reopening strategy of governments seems to not matter too much. And the reason is that the economic behavior in states that reopen and states that don't reopen is fairly similar, meaning that economic actors, companies and consumers take similar views globally and are cautious. Even though the government opens up, the view that businesses and that consumers have seems to be rather same cautious in countries that open up and in countries that don't open up. So I thought this is quite an interesting fact here to share. Now, if you look at the impact on businesses, some industries are expected to open up faster and some are expected to take longer. Obviously, tourism and hospitality is the one that is expected to take longest, while consumer electronics are least impacted and should recover relatively quickly. Now, the interesting point about this slide here is that it was originally produced for 2020. So full recovery for tourism was originally forecasted for Q4 2020. Now, obviously, we all know by now that this hasn't happened. And I think the slide is still relevant, but we have to relate those quarter numbers probably to the year 2022 instead, so 2 years later. So recovery is likely to happen within these quarters in 2022. I think this is still relevant and, of course, to be seen. Now, I want to end this section by looking at what, as a business leader, what do we have to look out for? What do we have to monitor? What do we have to be aware of as we talk about the business impact of the global pandemic? And there's 4 things that stand out, at least to me. Number 1 is we see shifts in profitability levels. The second is we see also shifts in debt levels. Debt levels have been rising, and for all major economic actors, which are households, corporates, and governments, we see the debt levels rise. The third and the most recent and most widely discussed right now at this time in January 2022 is inflation, and that is also something that we have to be aware of. And fourth is what McKinsey calls the Great Attrition. So basically a shift in the workforce that leads to, well, first of all, unemployment, but also voluntary unemployment and voluntary change of jobs that business leaders have to be aware of. I want to quickly go into each of those 4 factors. So the first is the shift in profitability. We see And this is the stock exchange of Thailand, the 50 largest companies here in Thailand, as an example. We see that are significant losers and also some winners here. And it depends really on the industry. One of the big losers, obviously, is the airport of Thailand. So what you see here, the number here, the minus 32, means a percentage point change in EBIT margin. So meaning for AOT here in this example, the EBIT margin has dropped by 32 percentage points. So for example, if it would have been 10% before the crisis, it would be now minus 22% profitability. So AOT, Airports of Thailand, obviously is in the travel sector and therefore heavily impacted. Same for Minor International, which is a hotel and hospitality company, also heavily impacted by the crisis. On the positive side, we see Sea-Trunk Gloves, for example. That is a company that produces rubber gloves, which are used for medical purposes in hospitals, for example, but also in the hospitality industry, in the food industry, for hygiene standards. And that obviously sees a very big jump in profitability. Same also for DTEC, for example, which is a mobile phone operator. As we went into the crisis, into shutdowns, into lockdowns, people staying at home, they used their mobile phone more. They used their mobile phones to connect to the internet. And therefore, the profitability for those kind of companies went up. So we see winners and losers, but it depends really on the industry. And this shift in the profitability is maybe to some extent temporary, but it will have a long-lasting impact on the recovery of those companies, because for those heavy losers, it will take some time to recover their financials. Now, the second challenge is debt levels being on the rise. And we see this here for households, corporates, and for governments. Now, what is interesting here for this chart, which compares the change in debt levels globally for different countries, is that the level of household debt, corporate level debt, and government debt varies depending on what policy choices the different governments made. For example, if a government took a very aggressive approach, like for example, in countries like the US or in Canada, then you will see the government debt level rise quite significantly, while the corporates and the households benefit from that because the government spends that money on those economic actors. In other countries where the government took a more careful approach and didn't inject so much money into the economy, the household level debt and the non-financial corporate level debt will have increased quite a bit more. So going into each of those economic actors in a little bit of detail, we see record household level debts in 2020. So this is data from 2020 from Statista, and it shows as percent of the GDP of that country, the household level debt. So we see in Thailand, for example, in 2020, the household debt was at 160%. So 1.6 times the total GDP of the country. In Hong Kong, obviously much higher. This is 2.6 times. And in the US, 2.2 times the total GDP. For corporate levels, and this is Thailand data here just as an example, we also see a significant jump in 2020. So from 2016 to 2020, on average, corporate level debt has gone up already, on average about 12%, 12.6%, so 13% per year. But the big jump really happened between 2019 and 2020, where corporate level debt for the 796 stock exchange listed companies in Thailand went up by 26%, so by 1/4. And we also see this in the debt to capital ratios. Now, it's a little bit hard to see from this chart, but if you compare the bottom, which is Q3 2019, with the top, which is Q3 2020, so 1 year later, the debt to capital ratios of the 50 largest stock exchange listed companies in Thailand has gone up significantly for almost every company. There's a few exceptions, but almost every company sees an increase from the bottom chart, which is Q3 2019, to the top chart, which is Q3 2020. So suggesting that corporate level debts really have risen and that corporates had to take additional debt to manage through the crisis. Last year on debt, the government debt. So we see that in 2010, the global map of government debt looked something like this. And I jump to the next page and you will see the change in color and the drastic change. If you just do it 10 years later, so in 2020, the color has become much more deeper green and deeper red. Much more deeper red compared to the previous slide, suggesting that governments actually went into significantly higher debt. And to give an example, we see this here for the UK national debt, just as a further example, where really the debt level has risen in 2008 during the financial crisis, but then again made a jump in May 2020 during the most recent crisis. So governments also had to take significant amounts of debt to manage through the crisis. And we see this globally for developed economies much more than for emerging economies, but also for both emerging economies and developed economies, the debt rate has actually increased significantly during the years of 2019, 2020. Now, the third challenge and widely discussed during these times is inflation. This chart shows the US inflation rate over the past 25 years. And this data at least suggests that as we go into 2022, at the end of 2021, we see a very, very significant rise in inflation at a level of around 7%, which at least for the past 25 years hasn't been seen. The highest level of inflation we actually had around the financial crisis in 2008, which brought us to almost 6%, but the most recent levels of inflation have not been seen, at least in the last 25 years. Now, why do we see that high level of inflation? Basically in three categories. So the first is consumers. Consumers, after having had to stay home for quite a while, are now flush with savings. Also, there's government stimulus programs that consumer can refer back to globally. And because of this restricted spending during the pandemic, there's now pent-up demand, and consumers are willing to spend their savings and as the economy opens, to indulge in some level of spending. Now, this is not the same in every country, but at least for the US, for example, this would be the case, and also for most parts of Europe. On the supply side, we have actually fewer workers in the labor market, and therefore suppliers to the global economy see rising wages and reduced productivity, and therefore are forced to bring up the prices. Also, energy prices have increased as a consequence of the reopening, and therefore those prices affect the supply side of things, and suppliers are forced to increase the prices, same as the rising wages. Finally, we see supply chain disruptions. So there's a shortage of drivers, as we have seen most recently in the UK. Seaport slots are rare, and warehouse space is also scarce. That all leads to higher costs, higher shipping rates, and again, suppliers have to, if they can, pass on these costs to their customers and eventually to the end consumer, and therefore we see higher price inflation. And companies are also faced with higher costs of production. Producing companies are faced with higher costs, and they pass these costs on to consumers. And one phenomenon that we also see is that some companies actually don't face necessarily these higher costs, but they see the whole situation as a rare opportunity to actually raise prices. So they see an opportunity to improve their profitability by raising prices. Now, this might not be the majority of companies, but there are certainly industries that also benefit from this price inflation or try to take benefit from it. And just as an example of how this impacts the food industry, for example, so on the left side, you see container prices from 2020 to 2021. 40-foot RF stands for refrigerated, and TRIS is non-refrigerated. So you see the freight rates rise for any type of container, in fact, the 40-foot, the 20-foot container. And on the right side, you see the categories, the supply itself. Dairy prices are up, oil prices are up by about 10 to 11%, grain prices are up by 13%, packaging is up by 4.8%, almost 5%, wheat is up by 27%. So significant price increases across all categories, in fact, therefore impacting the companies in the food industry. And that, of course, if possible, is passed on to consumers, and therefore we see price inflation. Finally, we also see a new phenomenon here, which McKinsey calls the Great Attrition. What we see here is that in the most recent survey, 40% of employees say that they want to leave the company in the next 3 to 6 months. So employees went through the crisis, and there's a couple of impacts here. Some of the employees feel that they have not been treated fairly, and that they felt not valued by their managers. That is true for 54% of employees. And 51% leave because they don't have a feeling of belonging at work. So this is something maybe caused by working from home and a little bit of a disconnect between the companies and their employees, but it is definitely something that business leaders have to have on the radar as they look at the crisis impact and the aftermath of the crisis. Now, the crisis also brings opportunities. And again, I want to bring the example of the food industry, which is the industry that I'm obviously very familiar with. A couple of opportunities that come out of the crisis. First, we see that many companies have now transformed their P&L, their profit and loss statement, and have managed down cost. And as they go into the recovery of the crisis, their profitability actually has quite a bit improved. So that is one positive impact and one opportunity that companies have, that they probably stand, they're much more sound and much more prepared for what is coming after the crisis. Many companies were forced to accelerate their digital transformation. So that is also a big jump that has happened for many companies during the crisis, which is positive in the long run. The investments that have been made into digital have a positive impact there. Now, in many countries, companies were dependent on tourism, especially in Thailand. And the whole crisis has forced companies to shift to higher sustainability, more sustainability in terms of catering for local population, sourcing locally. So all of this has a positive impact on the sustainability in absence of tourism. And finally, also related to sustainability, but more in terms of business continuity, I think the crisis has put all the business continuity systems to a test. So if anything like this will happen again, I think companies will be much better prepared and much more ready, and have proven that they can continue their business even under the most adverse circumstances. So all of these aspects also represent an opportunity for businesses. Now we have discussed the business impact. Now let's have a look at one of the other markets, which is the financial markets. And here, as you will see, I put 3 question marks behind the question whether it was actually a crisis or whether we are actually still in the crisis mode, given the situation that the financial markets are in. So for sure, the crisis had a very severe impact in the months of March and April 2020. Stock markets really collapsed, went down significantly. We see here the stock exchange of Thailand, for example, went down from a level of 1,600, 1,700 points down to a level of almost like 1,000 only. So that's a very, very significant drop by almost half, basically. So the initial impact on the stock market was very severe, but just 1 year later, already the stock market almost recovered to pre-COVID levels. And again, this is the stock exchange of Thailand. So we see a significant jump. Actually, the big jump that you see here in the latter half of the chart is the announcement that there was a vaccine, which again gave another boost to the already recovering stock exchange. Now, not all companies were equally affected. And we see here, for example, the cruise lines and hospitality players. This is Carnival Corporation, which operates big cruise ships. Their stock price obviously has been depressed and has continued to be depressed as we went through the crisis. Same for Minor International. The stock has recovered already quite a bit, but is not seeing yet the same levels as prior to the crisis. So cruise lines, hospitality companies were more heavily affected. And of course, there were also winners. So one winner, for example, is BioNTech, who collaborated with Pfizer on one of the vaccines. The stock has jumped very significantly over the course of the crisis. And also Moderna, the other vaccine player, also multiplied their stock very significantly, their stock price very significantly over the course of the crisis. Now, the stock market has continued to be on a boom over the past, basically almost 2 years now, since the heavy impact from the crisis. The curve has gone straight up. This is the S&P 500 that reached all-time highs in most recent month. And this begs the question, really, is there a disconnect between the real economy that still, where many companies still struggle, and the stock market? And I want to put this out as a question, of course, to be discussed and to be discussed controversially. But I want to give at least some statistics here that might help consider or discuss this question. And what I want to point out here is the PE ratio of the total market. So two statistics here, the S&P 500, so the 500 largest companies in the United States, and also the NASDAQ, so the tech companies in the United States. And the PE ratio is the price earnings ratio, so the price relative to the net profit of the companies that are in the index. And the PE ratio of the S&P 500 as of 15th of January 2022 stood at 25.6. Normal levels are in between 16 and 20. So in normal years, over the past decades, the PE ratio has been between 16 and 20, and now stands at 25. So definitely prices in the market are up, and you could question whether companies are overvalued, but that is still seems to be still manageable. 20 versus 25, that is still in a very moderate level. However, in the NASDAQ, the numbers look very differently. Here, the PE ratio as of 15th January 2022 is 125.7. So 125 times earnings is the price level of the NASDAQ index overall. And that is at very, very high level and has increased also significantly versus the previous year. So the question is, do we have a tech bubble? Are tech stocks overpriced? Now we see some very recent corrections here in the market. So that suggests that probably the market was overheated, but the future will tell what the market brings here. Now, this was a brief look at the financial markets. Now I want to conclude this session with a quick look at the social impact that the financial crisis had. And I want to put a link here to this video by PBS NewsHour, looking at the social crisis in the United States that the COVID pandemic caused. Now this is a couple of months old now, so obviously the situation has improved already in the US as the country is opening up and we are returning to normal. But it is a good reminder of how serious the impact was, and especially which type of parts of the population the crisis hit hardest. We also see one phenomenon, especially in countries that haven't fully recovered yet, and that is the high unemployment rate. So unemployment in Thailand has been always very low. Historically, it has always been around 0.9 to 1% historically. But we saw that jump really as the crisis hit, and the numbers haven't come down. On the contrary, actually, as of the latest quarter towards the end of 2021, the unemployment rate in Thailand is at a record high of 2.25%. I know if you look at global numbers, this seems relatively low, but keeping in mind that the reporting of unemployment in Thailand is at a different level than in more developed countries. Therefore, this jump from around 1% to more than double is very significant and has a very significant impact on the Thai population, and especially on the working population, which is also the middle class and the poorer people in the country. In the US, we also saw a very, very significant jump in unemployment rate as the COVID crisis hit. However, as the economy opened up again, businesses resumed, and so the unemployment rate is coming down again. But again, if you look at the figures here, it is not at pre-crisis levels yet, even though it has been improving quite a lot. Now, the challenge that this brings is also, and connecting now this chapter with the previous chapter, which is the stock market and the financial markets, we see an increasing inequality in wealth distribution. So Thailand, for example, and you see here other countries, Russia, Turkey, India, they are already among the highest in terms of unequal wealth distribution. Yeah? So you see here the share of national wealth held by the 1%, the richest 1% of the population. So in Thailand, for example, and this is data from a few years ago already, the richest 1% of the population hold 67% of the national wealth. And you can imagine, as the stock market rebounds and as stock markets reach all-time highs, these are the people that benefit from this rebound in the stock market, and they become even more wealthy. Now, the people who don't benefit from this are the people in the lower middle class and in the lower classes who don't have shares, who don't trade shares, who don't participate in the financial markets in the same way. So what we see here already, and this is, unfortunately, I don't have the data for post-crisis, but already prior to the crisis, we saw that wealth gap of the poorest 50% and the richest 10% here widening between 2007 and 2018 as a consequence also of the financial crisis in 2008 and the aftermath, which saw the stock markets rise very significantly. And again, without having the data here, but we can expect that the impact will be as severe for the most recent crisis, and that the wealth gap probably has further widened. Now, this is a challenge for the society, and it is something that for sure will become very relevant in the near future, and will have to be addressed by governments globally, but especially in the countries that are listed here. So we are at the end of our review of the COVID-19 crisis. What I try to do is I try to bring you some facts and show you the latest statistics and give you an overview of where we stand right now, and as business leaders, what we have to look at and also what we have to be aware of going forward. I want to close this with expressing my hope that we are through the worst. All the figures point towards like higher immunization, lower hospitalizations, lower death rates. So hopefully we will see significant recovery in 2022. I wish that to all of us. Thank you so much for watching this video, and all the best.